Welcome to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast. I'm John, Father John Deere, and today I'm speaking with my friend Bishop John Stowe, president of Pax Christi, USA. This podcast is a project of www.beatitudecenter.org, where you can find many other podcasts and regular Zoom programs on the nonviolence of Jesus and practicing nonviolence and working for a more just, more nonviolent world. So I always like to begin with a little prayer, so I invite all our listeners, wherever you are, just to take a deep breath first and to relax and recenter yourselves. And I invite you to enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves you infinitely and personally. And let's welcome the risen nonviolent Jesus here with us. Just take a moment to ask for whatever graces we need to follow Jesus more faithfully. God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life, love, and peace that you give us. Be with us now as we reflect together on your call to follow the nonviolent Jesus. Bless us, inspire us, disarm us, heal us, strengthen us, and send us out to do your will, to proclaim your way of love and peace and nonviolence, that we might do our part together to help end poverty, racism, corporate greed, gun violence, war, injustice, nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, and the whole culture of violence, that we might be your holy beatitude people, your holy peacemakers. We ask this mighty blessing in Jesus' name. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce to you all and welcome today my friend Bishop John Stowe. He's the Bishop of Lexington, Kentucky, and the president of Pax Christi, USA. He's been my friend for, I think, 35 years now, since we were in theology school together back in the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. He is a member of the Conventual Friars Minor and entered them as a Franciscan in 1984, was ordained a priest in 1995 and served in El Paso, Texas, and then served as the vicar general there, and then the chancellor there, and then the vicar provincial of his Franciscan province. And then in 2015, Pope Francis named him the Bishop of Lexington, Kentucky, and then he became president of Pax Christi in 2018. Wow. Well, welcome, Bishop John Stowe from Lexington, Kentucky. Thanks for being here, John.
Well, thank you, Father John, and thanks for doing this work at the Beatitude Center and for making these podcasts available. You've had some pretty good guests on there, so I hope I'm not disappointing.
No, it's great.
A series of folks you have.
It's great. Thank you. I'm thrilled to have you. So I was thinking, coming here today, I'm in the central coast of California, about your journey and mine, knowing you for so long. I remember you as a young Franciscan seminarian. We were both at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. And then you're the Bishop of Lexington, Kentucky, and the president of Pax Christi, USA. So I thought it'd be really nice if you just shared informally a little bit of your journey over your life as a follower of the nonviolent Jesus.
Sure. I mean, when you put it that way, that's quite a stretch of time, and I'm not exactly sure how every step unfolded, but I went to the Graduate Theological Union and specifically enrolled in the Jesuit school right after the Jesuits martyrs of El Salvador.
Oh, wow.
And I specifically asked permission to study with the Jesuits because of the commitment to faith in action, and faith and justice going together. And so it was there that I met with the Pax Christi movement there at the school and beyond in the Bay Area, and it was very fruitful. It was also the time, if you remember, of the first Gulf War and so many demonstrations. And we weren't far from the Concord Naval Weapons Station and having to do demonstrations there, and the Nevada test site and all of that. So it really influenced my approach to theology and has been with me ever since. I also find the Franciscan spirituality, that's part and parcel of my religious spirituality, is Francis the Peacemaker, who saw the connections between all of creation, but worked to reconcile enemies and people who could not get along. So when I left after graduating, my first assignment in the parish was, as you mentioned in that little biography, in El Paso, Texas. and being sent to the border, and the parish was literally on the border at a time when there was great militarization of the border going on, and we saw more and more violent acts against people just trying to come across the river Rio Grande for a better life, and meeting violence from the Border Patrol and from other entities of the state. It was a time to reaffirm that commitment to nonviolence. And I lived in a community that was partially Native American, which they have a great spirituality of connection to the earth and to all other people, and Mexican American. And knowing the history of that area, it was so clear that people of different cultures and backgrounds can very much get along and work together and create something beautiful. But a different narrative was being told across the country about the so-called crisis at the border. And now, decades later, we're still talking about that same kind of thing. And we're still seeing people who are trying to get away from gang violence and state violence in their homelands being treated as violent themselves, even when in most cases what they're coming here to do is to work and make a better life for themselves and their families. So that's really been essential to my ministry. I say the time in El Paso really formed me as a pastor and formed me as a priest to be attentive to people's needs. And, you know, the desire to live in a more peaceful world was so manifest. After 15 years there, partially in chancery administration, but always with a foot in parish work, and most of the time as a pastor as well, I was made vicar provincial, so had responsibilities within the Franciscan order, and was also at our national shrine of Our Lady of Consolation in Cary, Ohio. And the ministry there, in a large part, the pilgrims that come are Chaldean Catholics from Iraq. And I heard so many stories of people that had been in refugee camps that had been displaced by war. A whole different experience from the Iraq war, from what I knew about in Berkeley. But these were people who were refugees and getting away from that. So it only deepened the commitment that we have to find ways to move beyond war and find ways to get along together. And the 10 years now that I've been in Lexington has been an interesting time as well. It's connected my concern for the environment, especially in Appalachia and areas that were formerly coal mine dependent for livelihood, and trying to find the ways to be at peace with nature, as well as living in a pretty red state and trying to speak about the gospel in ways that are compelling and make sense, but don't come easily to people in this part of the world.
It's a great journey, Bishop John. Thank you for sharing that. I like that
just a few highlights.
Yeah, I know. There we could just have a long talk about your story, and it's still unfolding. You've had an amazing journey. I like that you call St. Francis the peacemaker. And the first question, I mean, we could talk about Jesus, of course, as the peacemaker, and as you and I think at the heart of the gospel is his call to become peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers. So let me ask you first about Jesus. As you know, and even with the name of this podcast, I've long taught and maintained that Jesus was totally nonviolent, and that if we're going to follow him, we have to try to somehow become totally nonviolent ourselves and work for a more nonviolent world, like Gandhi and Dorothy Day and Dr. King and Francis and Clare the Peacemakers. And now in 2017, Pope Francis, in his World Day of Peace message, said all of that. Jesus was totally nonviolent, and Catholics need to try to become nonviolent. I wonder if you could just reflect on what that means for you and for us and the church these days, right now, with what we're going through, that the nonviolence of Jesus and the calling to practice gospel nonviolence.
Well, I think once we start to understand Jesus as nonviolent, and whether it's if we're helped by the Pope to do that or through your own commentary on the New Testament, the Gospels, we recognize that peace and peace building and nonviolence are so essential to who Jesus is. And for Jesus, it was clearly the shalom of his Hebrew background of being a right relationship with God, right relationship with others, right relationship with all of creation. And that's not so easy for us to do. There's so many things that are competing for our allegiances. There are so many material comforts that can get in the way, and we don't even think about the sources or the people who are exploited to make our life, our consumeristic life, so easily accessible to us. And we really start doing a deep examination of conscience and recognize the need constantly to evaluate our relationships with God and with others. It's an important challenge, but once you are connected to that idea of Jesus as the peacemaker, it's hard not to see it when you read the Gospels. I think at this time, the real challenge, and one of the reasons I'm drawn to Pax Christi USA, is because it's rooted in a spirituality of nonviolence. And it's so essential to root out the violent tendencies within ourselves. And, I just watch the news and I see things that are being said by people in political office or in positions of authority. And there's an anger that builds up inside of me. And there's got to be an appropriate outlet for that so that it doesn't turn into the kind of violence. But it's also allowed me to understand better why people at some places and times feel that there's no option except to rise up and use violence. But we have to reject that as not providing the lasting solution that Jesus does.
Yeah.
So,
Mm-hmm.
no, I just said that's kind of a broad approach, but every day the struggle for me is just to overcome that tendency to judge another person, to look down on another person, or to think violently against their character. And the more we allow Christ into our life, into our prayers, way of praying and thinking, the more we have to recognize the other person as brother or sister. And that's not so easy.
I like that you say that once you see the Gospels and Jesus as a peacemaker, it's hard to go back. Like you go, oh, this is what it's all about. Why do you think the nonviolence and peacemaking of Jesus and his nonviolent resistance, really, to the empire is still so underemphasized, in the Christian tradition through history and even today around the world?
Well, 2,000 years later, it's still quite radical. I mean, it's just not easy to think of those values as being anything other than a dream or a utopia or something that is beyond this world. But Jesus was talking about the here and now and how we try to create this peaceful kingdom here and now. The church has domesticated Christ from very early in our history. And so it's easy to go along with Christ and my government, Christ and my political party, Christ and my army, whatever it is. We think that we can make these things compatible when Jesus is calling for a kind of allegiance that does not allow for the exploitative oppression that goes with the abuse of power in so many aspects of the contemporary world or any time in the last 2,000 years history.
During our lives as friends over the decades, we've both been, talking about Jesus and peacemaking, but we're sort of used to getting so much pushback from church people and other Christians that, we can still support war, or God wants us to be rich, or number one. But now we're in a whole new boat, and I wanted to ask you about what's happening right now under the Trump administration and his rhetoric. And what I'm seeing, and I want your take on it, is why has all of this rise of authoritarianism and fascism, oligarchy, even white supremacy, which is being publicly talked about, managed to be embraced and co-opted by so many Christians, including millions of Catholics across the U.S., including many bishops and many, many priests around the country? And what do you think about that?
Well, I guess in the context that we're speaking right now, perhaps the first thing is they haven't really discovered the nonviolent Jesus, and that nonviolent Jesus has not been preached enough on a regular basis in our churches. But I have to honestly admit, I struggle with understanding how this is possible. I struggle to get mail from people in my diocese accusing me of hating white people because I'm trying to dismantle racism. We talk about dismantling racism as some of the active work that Christians have to be doing. And the response is, why do you hate white people? And it buys into this whole notion that, you know, we can't all be brothers and sisters. So there's always got to be the scapegoat or the person that is the object of hatred or dislike rather than just brothers and sisters. Another letter I have to respond to today about angry that I said that people who've crossed the border without documents are not criminals, and goes into this whole reality. Well, God said we have to protect our own land and defend ourselves, and well, no, not if you look at the Jesus that God, the God that revealed by Jesus and the Jesus that's revealed in the scriptures. He doesn't say those things. But I think it really is a lack of faith that it's possible to live in a nonviolent way.
Well, one of the great things you've done is to step up to the plate in the official Catholic global peace movement, which is what, maybe almost 75, 80 years old. And you're the president of the U.S. branch, Pax Christi USA. And you and I have been part of it a long time. It works full time with the official support of the Vatican and the bishops around the world to promote disarmament, justice, and peace. So tell us about Pax Christi these days and what you'd like our listeners to know about Pax Christi and to join Pax Christi if they're not a member.
Sure. I think one of the most exciting things about Pax Christi USA right now is the number of young people that are getting involved, especially young adults, whether that's on college campuses, high school campuses, and in other places. They've created through all of our podcasting and networking a community that really sees the nonviolent Jesus and the peace movement as the way of being church today. We've also seen Pax Christi USA become something much more diverse in terms of our racial and economic backgrounds coming together. I think that's very exciting for the movement. So, like many other peace movements and like many other movements in general in the church and in society, we had a very aging membership, and God loved the people that have put their lives on the line for this and have been out there demonstrating and working for peace for generations. We love them and have so much to learn from them, but they themselves very frequently have wondered who's going to come after them. But I think it is an exciting time, and maybe it's one of the good things that comes out of this difficult time politically, and when democracy seems to be being undermined right now, and a violent bully in the White House trying to use violence as a way to get his will done, get his preferences accomplished across the line. I think that concerns enough people. They're looking for some way to do something and make some difference. And joining a community that is committed to prayer and study and action helps us to, number one, not let these Trump decisions become normalized and just something that we just deal with or see as part of everyday reality. We have to call attention to the fact that these are not normal things, and they're not part of our democratic tradition, certainly not part of our Christian tradition. And when we can pray and study and act together and take that holistic approach in a community, I think it's very fruitful as we're trying to promote the gospel of peace. So I would encourage people that are interested to learn more about it. PaxChristiUSA.org is a good source of information, and you can connect right away with people in your own age group, whatever that age group happens to be. We're planning a national conference the end of July this year in Detroit, which is a home to a lot of Arab Americans, and we know that they have suffered quite a bit because of the turmoil in the Middle East and the lack of peace in the Middle East, and so we can hear many of their stories. Detroit was also the home of Bishop Thomas Gumbleton, your friend, and the first bishop president of Pax Christi USA, who died last year. And we want to lift him up as a model of living within the church institution and promoting the gospel and the gospel of peacemaking.
Well, that's great. Thanks. I'm remembering, when we were together 35 years ago, during those years, I started 25 Pax Christi local groups. And we were going through, as you said, the murder of the Jesuits and then the Iraq War and then so much turmoil. And I always saw Pax Christi as a little base community movement, like the Latin Americans and African church. They're so far ahead of us. And that's what we need. And so your motto, the Pax Christi motto, the idea was go and start a group with 5 or 10 people and meet every other week. And just for an hour and like on a Thursday night, prayer, study, and action. Do a little praying, do a little study, and then plan together. And it was so life-giving. I mean, we were part of the Pax Christi Berkeley group. And so is that what you're saying, Bishop John, that, get together, don't be alone, form a little Pax Christi group, and here's this national network of support you can have?
Absolutely. And for those who don't have the means of doing it in real life, although that's always preferable, and with three-dimensional persons, it has been good to see young people connecting across the country and sharing the issues that affect them where they are and finding support in one another. So absolutely, so many people in this time when we're supposedly so connected digitally and otherwise, we really find a lot of loneliness, and that's not going to help a peace movement. But when people feel less helpless because they're with other people who share some of the same thoughts and ideas and can propose alternatives, that's where a movement becomes strong.
Yeah. So I visited you last year in Lexington at the university there, and I remember you were talking about your work in Appalachia and the environment. But in particular, you were telling me about your push for gun control and better gun legislation to help end gun violence. And you were focusing on Eastern Kentucky, which is very serious. So tell me about that and your hopes there, your work.
Sure. No, well, I wish I could say we have had more success here. And it seems like it's only when there's these major tragedies and mass killings, which now we barely even pay attention to. They're so frequent. That we can even begin a discussion about gun control. So we have to redouble our efforts now, I'm afraid. But it's another consequence of the failure to preach the nonviolent Jesus that I get a lot of pushback right from our own church members about, what do you mean we can't bring guns to church? What do you mean we can't be armed? We have to. But there's this whole notion of fear of the other, and you can't go into certain parts of town without protection, and you can't deal with other people without protection, without realizing that this violence and this addiction to guns has really affected us. But I can't claim any legislative gains there. I can't claim any conversion of hearts that I know of yet in that regard, but we can't let down our guard. We were trying to get something in front of the state, and then the bishops of Kentucky decided we wanted to have the other bishops in our province, which means the 3 dioceses of Tennessee involved, and it just got more complicated there from then on. But it doesn't mean I'll give up on that.
Right. I don't know if you remember that night, Bishop, you welcomed me and I spoke at the university, but in the front rows there were, I don't know, a couple of dozen college students. And they all were pretty unhappy with you and me talking for an hour about the nonviolence of Jesus. And afterwards, I deliberately was engaging them. And one of them, he was 19. And I said, I know you didn't like what I had to say. Well, why not? Well, tell me, go ahead, just come right out and tell me. I don't know if I told you this. And the poor kid said, well, I live up in maybe Chicago, and I came to Lexington. I've never been here, and arrived my first day when I was 18. He's 19 now. Totally terrified. So that night I went out and bought a gun. And I sleep with it under my pillow every night because I'm totally terrified about my life. What do you think of that, Father John? Gosh, Bishop, I think that's going on a lot around the country and the world. What would you say to that poor young guy?
Well, I do remember. I'm sorry I didn't get to meet him myself. I do remember you talking about it. And it's very disturbing, and why somebody would feel so threatened. it really shows that, and it's disconnected with their faith. The people that showed up are regular practicing Catholics.
Right. These were devout kids, actually.
They're devout, but we haven't made that connection. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was back in El Paso for a demonstration on the border of solidarity with migrants, and Cardinal Baggio from Rome, from the Dicastery of Integral Human Development, was present. He's the one that heads the migration section there.
Uh-huh.
And somebody asked him about, why do we not get more buy-in from our church about the human rights of immigrants, and why are we not resisting more what's happening in our country? And he asked a simple question. He said, how many of the catechism textbooks that you use, not the official catechism of the church, but the textbooks that you use in classrooms, how much do they talk about human rights? How much do they talk about peace? How much do they talk about the threat of war? And I'm afraid if you look at most of them, it doesn't get much of a mention. We know about the sacramental life. We get the devotion and the commandments and all those things that are essential to our faith. But how do we put those things to use in a very violent world? How do we build up a spirituality of nonviolence? It's not in there. So I was thinking of that simple answer from Cardinal Baggio, and I think it applies to that young man at the University of Kentucky, and to so many who've never been exposed to this way of thinking, that what we believe about Jesus has consequences for how we live our lives and how we relate with other people, and for our politics, which nobody wants to hear about in church.
Yeah, that's so great. I'm thinking of a story, experience I had when I first arrived 25 years ago as a pastor in these very poor parishes in New Mexico. And my friend, the older nun, said, "You're teaching confirmation." And I said, "No, I'm not. I can't." And she said, "You have to." So I had all these kids in the middle of the desert, and they're all high school, like 25 teenagers. I remember one of them, and all of them. And the first night there, I asked them to show me their textbook, their Sunday confirmation book. And between us, Bishop John, I thought it was so awful that I took a trash can and I went around the room and I collected them and threw them all out very dramatically, because I said, I think this is so boring. But I had come prepared, and I had bought a box of a really cool Bible with the best translation, and I dramatically gave each kid their own first Bible. John, I'll never forget, I saw them sit up in their chairs. It was like they suddenly were being treated with dignity and equal. And I said, we're going to read the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verse 1, and I want you to tell me everything you don't like about it. Again, they sat up, and then they were off and running, and all those kids became really engaged. What do you think about that? I got that from William Stringfellow. Like, we just need to help each other read the Gospels again. We're so far from the Gospels. That's kind of what I hear you saying.
That's it. I mean, we need to know who Jesus was, what his context was, and how he responded to the situation he was in. And it's not all that different from what we experience day to day. The people that Jesus called blessed in the Beatitudes were not the people that the empire called blessed. They were kind of the outcasts. And some people that don't think that they conform to the polite church will find a lot of comfort and excitement about the way that Jesus took on the establishments of his day.
Yeah.
Who would think that introducing the gospel to young people was such a radical idea? But apparently it is.
We are both very devoted to Pope Francis, who's so frail and ill now, but I think he's the greatest moral and spiritual leader in the world at this time. It's the brightest light there is. I would like to ask you any thoughts you have about him and the amazing things he's done, and his main message, and your own experience of being with him personally, and what you recommend for our listeners to take from Pope Francis's calls.
Sure. I've really been moved by Francis from the very beginning of his pontificate. I was excited when he took the name Francis and when he said why he took the name Francis, so that because a cardinal from Brazil told him to never forget the poor. And I think he brings the whole Latin American experience and all its richness with him to the center of the church and shares that richness, which is it's so community based. And he brings that Ignatian spirituality from his Jesuit background, the gifts of discernment. And I think he puts that together in such a way that it brings the Catholic social teaching to the center of what the church is about, and not a fringe thing or a specialization within the church or within theology. I think he's brought the practice, whether he calls it an approach to mercy, whether he talks about it in terms of fratelli tutti, that we're all brothers and sisters, when it's laudato si, in right relationship with all of creation, his World Day of Peace message, as you mentioned, from 2017, about the nonviolent Christ. I think all these things fit together really in a harmonic way with Pope Francis. And he smiles as he does it, and he can laugh with people and joke with people, even when he's coming out of this long illness. Pictures of him on Sunday just greeting the crowds and smiling and laughing with people. I think it touches them in such a deep way. But he has not hidden from us the pain that he feels with so much war going on in the world. When he made it over to the Russian embassy, breaking all protocol and everything else when the war against Ukraine started, and he wanted to plead for peace in person, when he got down on his hands and knees and kissed the feet of the competing or warring leaders in Sudan and South Sudan, and kissed their feet, begging them to be peacemakers. I mean, when he was wheeled in his wheelchair into the Congo, into a war zone, and listened to the victims of war and literally touched their wounds. I mean, he is so prophetic in gesture and in thought. And I'm sure he's just what the church and the world needs at this time. And I hope we can see somebody following him in that same vein, or that his message would be more widely received.
Yes, he's amazing and not really followed here in the United States. But you know that Marie Dennis and I and our friends have for some 10 years now been lobbying him and working at the Vatican, asking him to write a full-on church encyclical about the nonviolence of Jesus, like he did in Laudato Si about climate change and the Catholic response and so forth. Just briefly, could you tell us the story about how, when one of your conversations with him, you asked him about that?
Sure. It was a very brief interchange when I was in front of him and there was a line of people behind me. But his first response was that fratelli
Wait, what
tutti
did you
is...
ask him? What did you ask him?
Well, I asked him about that encyclical on nonviolence, and I said, I know you've got people encouraging that. Can we expect that anytime soon? And he said, fratelli tutti is the encyclical on nonviolence, because for him, it's all about relationship. It's all about this interconnection.
Yeah, I'm trying to get him to use the word more, to write an encyclical actually on Jesus and nonviolence. So we keep going. Let me ask you, and we'll begin to wrap it up. And you've touched on this before about the importance of a spirituality of nonviolence in these times, with so much hatred and division and confusion and chaos, and many people feeling overwhelmed. On the one hand, numb and depressed and despairing and giving up. On the other, really angry and maybe even, as you mentioned, feeling violence towards perpetrators of evil, people doing this, supporting discrimination and cruelty carried out by the Trump administration. So tell me more specifically, if you would, about some thoughts on a spirituality of nonviolence to help us concretely avoid, on the one hand, giving up and giving into despair and fear and anger and worry, and instead, but to sustain us for the long haul, to keep getting involved, to keep speaking out and taking public action as Christians, as Catholics, for God's reign of justice and discernment and peace. So the inner work of a spirituality of peace and nonviolence.
Sure. And that inner work has got to start with the individual and our relationship with the Word of God, and reflect on that Word of God made flesh in the person of Jesus and how he lived his life, and then pray for the grace, ask for the grace to be able to live that way, to absorb violence rather than contribute to violence, to be about forgiveness and 70 times, 7 times and more. And I think we have to be very clear about not allowing the horrible stuff that we see all around us just to become background noise, but we have to confront it. I think that's another important thing that Pope Francis says in Fratelli Tutti is we can't just paper over our differences, and you're not going to resolve violence by forgetting about the violence of the past. It has to be healed. And we heal when we go forward with hope. And we can only go forward with hope when people's suffering is recognized, when the wounds are touched, and when we chart a new path together to go forward. So again, it sounds otherworldly, and in a sense it is, but it's what Jesus calls us to do in the here and now. And in this Easter season, we should be thinking about that transformation that Jesus' death and resurrection brings about. Jesus coming forth from the tomb and appearing to his disciples sends them to pronounce the forgiveness of sins, not to get revenge for what was done to him. And that's a great guiding spirit for us.
And that's a beautiful note maybe to wrap up our time together. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss or say or mention before we wrap it up?
No, I just think we have to sustain each other in hope. We have to continue to remind each other that we're not just dreamers, that it is possible to overcome the hatred and violence that are so prevalent in our world, but we have to take a step towards that. So thanks for what you're doing. Thanks for what these podcasts are doing. Thanks for what you've created a network of people all over to be able to do.
Well, thank you very much, Bishop John Stowe, for speaking with me today. And thank you, friends, for listening to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast. You can hear many other podcasts and find other upcoming Zoom programs at beatitudecenter.org. Please consider offering a donation to support this free work. And if you can, please leave some positive feedback or write a review in the NCR or Apple or Spotify or whatever platform you use. So may the God of peace bless us all. Keep on following the nonviolent Jesus, and see you all next time. Thank you so much.